Nearly 2 years ago, I made a video about the Souls-like Lies of P, and in that video, I talked about how Lies of P was a game that genuinely blew me away back in 2023. I had kept an eye on it since its initial reveal, and my expectations only grew higher with every trailer that was released. To say that the game exceeded my expectations would be quite the understatement. In that original video, I went so far as to say that Lies of P ruined Dark Souls for me. And the thing is, at least to some extent, I still hold that belief. Lies of P's combat is everything that I think the Souls games could be, with its own unique flair and flavor. While I don't literally believe that the Souls games are worthless now, Lies of P proved to me that there was still a lot to be tapped into within this genre that I think a lot of people will not give a chance simply because it's not made by From Software. And that is a real shame, because there was so much passion and so much heart put into Lies of P that I could not say that Dark Souls combat feels a bit empty in comparison. The emphasis on parrying instead of dodging, the really clever and unique skill tree system that the game implemented on top of its brilliant weapon combination system, and its heartfelt narrative made me not only irritate and annoy From Software superfans with my praise of the game, but firmly planted it as potentially one of my all-time favorite games. That being said, in that video, I said that even if in the future my feelings on Lies of P waned a bit, hindering its ranking in my tier list of Souls games, that shouldn't really matter, because first impressions are literally everything. There are only a small, tiny amount of games that ever get a real second chance in the general public's eye. My first and second playthrough of Lies of P left me fully engaged and just downright stunned with not only how clean and smooth nearly everything felt, which made the game feel comparable with any original From Software title, but truly affected by the game's narrative, which made me care about the characters and the world surrounding them. I ranked Lies of P number 2 in that list, which annoyed a lot of those fans, which was really funny, and at that point in time, I meant it. Lies of P did not literally ruin Dark Souls for me, but it did make me wish that Dark Souls felt more like Lies of P did, which in turn made the Souls games feel less enjoyable in comparison. And now, nearly 2 years out from the game's release, there is finally DLC, a PLC if you will, as well as a big update, DLC or not, that includes some adjustments and quality of life enhancements to the base game, which means that I now have a reason to come back to this game and not feel like I'm not being productive. I have so much shit going on. After my initial video on Lies of P released, I started a fresh new game for a third run, but stopped at roughly the midway point of the game's narrative before dropping the game entirely due to needing to focus on other games for other videos and other projects. But almost 2 years is, well, a while. And that means that my skill set in Lies of P dwindled away and dulled like the disregarded blade of a poor Lies of P player who forgets to sharpen it before an important boss fight. This was, however, a blessing in disguise, as Lies of P Overture follows in line with the Dark Souls DLC lineage, where it's something that you have to do at some point during the main campaign, such as in Dark Souls 1, having to play up to, you get the Lord Vessel, you have to go to the Darkroot Basin, kill the Hydra, go to Darkroot Basin, behind the waterfall, do all this stupid nonsense, and then you can finally access the DLC. While Overture is not nearly as complicated as accessing any DLC in literally any of the Souls games, the DLC in Overture is not something that you can just do, like in Witcher 3 for example. When it initially dropped, the new areas were locked behind simply reaching Chapter 9 in Lies of P's story. And by that point, you'll basically have just been blatantly given the item needed to access the DLC, which thankfully meant that the playthrough that I had abandoned all that time ago was essentially a prime candidate to pick back up and get into the DLC rather quickly, as I was in Chapter 7, which only meant I had to push a bit before accessing it. But in the time that it took to actually access the DLC, I got my first taste of Lies of P in nearly 2 years, and man, this game fucking rips, dude. I'm not going to go into much detail about the base game, because if you want to hear my thoughts on the base game, please take the time and watch my initial video on Lies of P right here. But the base game, whatever you can say about it, whether it's derivative of games like Bloodborne or not up to the level of quality of a FromSoft game, is quite simply, far and away, one of the best Souls-likes not made by From Software. In my opinion, Lies of P still holds up as a shining example of what can be done with the formula. Sure, the level design isn't as expansive as the original Dark Souls or Elden Ring, and yeah, the RPG character build variety isn't quite as high or variable as the Souls games, but with all of the fun additions like the aforementioned weapon customization and the incredibly diverse Legion arms, Lies of P can still feel fresh with each and every playthrough. Its combat is relentless, intensely satisfying, and with its emphasis on parrying, I hardly ever feel like the game is cheating or that any given death is anything other than my fault. And that's not to say that the Dark Souls games aren't fair and balanced, but with the Souls games' emphasis on dodging, I personally just feel that parrying is not only more satisfying, but with the way that I engage with these games, it is by far the preferred method. Dodging is exhilarating. I would never deny that, as it feels like you've narrowly avoided imminent death. But with parrying, it feels like you're slowly dominating the fight, as each attack your enemy tries to hit you with, instead of backing up or out of the fight, you push into it instead. Parrying feels like denying your opponent instead of robbing them, which is what I feel dodging is comparable to. And Lies of P, in my opinion, does this nearly perfectly. I mentioned in that original video that Lies of P feels like if Sekiro was turned into a more traditional Souls game, and I think that point is one of the most important of that original video. I believe that sums up the gameplay in one sentence better than just saying it's a Souls game with a parry. Now, is the game perfect? No, of course not. And I would like to note that playing through the game again for the DLC made me realize a couple of things that I wish I had brought up in that original video. Most of them are pretty moot, but the most egregious of all of them is the fact that unlike Souls games, Lies of P has a truly irritating tendency for you to get stuck on the world's geometry, especially during boss fights, and that might force the camera in such a way that makes the combat encounter borderline unplayable. If this happens, it's usually the game's fault, and almost never yours, as by the time that you realize you're stuck, the enemy has closed the distance between you, and you're essentially stuck there being pummeled until you die. Now, I can't say for certain how many times that happened to me, but it certainly was more than 10. I actually can't see. Which is, in my opinion, at least 9 times too many. But at some point, you have to wonder why they have nearly every object that couldn't be broken into a hitbox that you could get stuck on. The amount of times that this happened to me in the Souls series is probably under 10 in literally all of them combined. Of all of the things that I could have talked about regarding being more negative about Lies of P, this is the biggest one, and I do genuinely regret not bringing it up in that original video. But other than that, coming back to Lies of P truly felt wonderful. Even if you don't own the DLC, the game has been updated with a patch that affects the base game on its own that adds a bunch of quality of life updates, such as easy access to cracking ergo fragments while in the level up menu, which is a huge time saver and honestly needs to be applied to every From Software Souls game from here on out. It adds a boss rematch system which, dear God in heaven, please give this to more of your games, FromSoft. Adding it to Sekiro was a good idea. Shame it's only used there, God forbid. It adds an ease of access to look at your P organ from the menu of the game instead of forcing you to run back to Hotel Krat to see what abilities you have or what you want to unlock. All of these little additions are genuinely fantastic and well-appreciated additions that make the already pretty smooth flow of the game work that much better, and the added boss rematch system is just the icing on the cake. But most importantly, and most controversial of all, they added a difficulty system. Nah, to be honest, all I'm gonna say about this is pretty simple. If you don't want to make the game easier, don't fucking use it. It's that simple. I didn't use it. I played the entire DLC on the base difficulty, and despite some frustrating moments and boss encounters that absolutely stomped me, oh my fucking god! I persevered and got good, but never would I ever shame anyone for lowering the difficulty. That's the world we should all aim for. A lower difficulty does mean that more people can get through the game, and if they like it, odds are they'll play it on a harder difficulty. But Overture, as a DLC and expansion, does what I think great DLC of today should do, and it does it excellently. It reminds you how good the original game is. The same thing happened to me with the DLC for the Resident Evil 4 remake. It was released several months after the original game came out, and the time frame in between them was just long enough that when I finally got around to playing Separate Ways, I had forgotten that, holy shit, Resident Evil 4 Remake is fucking incredible, isn't it? Overture has both the benefit and the curse of being released nearly 2 years after the original game, which means for a lot of us, that feeling of, holy shit, this is incredible, will likely hit like a sack of bricks to the skull, but in turn will also likely frustrate you because the skill floor in order to not only get to the DLC, but completing it is pretty high to begin with. The long time in between releases means that you will have to relearn a lot of the game to at least some extent. Relearning the beats, the rhythm of combat, and the little things like item usage and combos between weapons and Legion arms are all things that most of us are going to have to overcome in relearning in order to get the full scope of the DLC. And the scope of this expansion is exactly what I think a lot of us wanted out of it. It doesn't do anything too out of the unusual or out of line with the base game. Instead, what Overture does is just give us new enemies, new looks at characters that we have had and have not ever met before in the base game, new lore, new weapons, new mechanics, new Legion arms, basically just more stuff that flows pretty seamlessly into and out of the base game. One of my favorite things that was added is something that in hindsight is really so simple design-wise, but is everything that I love in game design, which is the upgrade core to your P organ. As a reminder, the P organ is essentially just your skill tree, and terrible name aside, is unironically one of my favorite things from the original game. Being able to invest abilities into the already specified upgrade that you want to unlock in the first place is a system that feels incredibly unique to a Souls-like, if not in general. What Overture introduces to this system is pretty simple, and in hindsight is a bit surprising that it wasn't in the original game in some form or fashion. Throughout the DLC, you'll find upgrade cores, and when you take them back to the chair at the older version of Hotel Krat, you can use them to essentially enhance a chosen quartz ability, making that ability stronger. My only real critique with this is that they don't do that much with it. You only find about 2 or 3, at least from what I experienced in the DLC, which must have been some sort of balancing issue. I could see the potential problem with being given a lot of these throughout the expansion, as coming back to the endgame of the base game could lead to some overpowered and broken abilities. But as a concept, as well as being limited to the DLC, I like this addition a lot. This little extra bit of fine-tuning that you're allowed with this mechanic is exactly the kind of stuff that I look for in expansions like this. Once you actually gain access to the DLC proper, even after a patch that tones down the difficulty of the initial area of the expansion, the game wastes no time in brutally punishing you with new areas and new enemies. As you trek through the zoo, you encounter a lot of animal creatures that showcase how relentless this DLC is going to be capable of. Huge bears and giant baboons will pummel you into the dirt throughout a majority of the first area of this DLC. To say that it was hard would be an understatement, as each new section of the zoo opened up to me, the new enemies introduced would often hit so hard that it took roughly 2 hours just to make it to the first main checkpoint. Ugh, it's the same fucking thing twice in a row now. And if I'm being honest, my initial feelings towards the DLC during this point weren't that great. It felt like the team took some lessons that I felt weren't in line with what the main game was doing. I personally feel that Lies of P can be incredibly difficult, and outside of that annoying issue of occasionally being stuck on terrain, the game always felt incredibly fair, albeit incredibly punishing. However, at first, my experience with this DLC was incredibly frustrating, as it felt like a lot of the difficulty was going to be surrounding you with smaller enemies, while bigger, tougher, and more durable enemies would be waiting in the midst, which is something that I think the Souls games are not really designed for. I've said this countless times before, but just in case, I think that Souls games are at their best when relying on tactical and deliberate 1v1 combat. Even a game like Dark Souls 3, which is much faster than the previous Souls games as well as Lies of P, feels like it should be better equipped for a mob of enemies, but in my opinion, just doesn't. Despite my overall dislike of Dark Souls 3, the game is at its best when it does rely on its 1v1 combat roots. The game's speed is incongruent with its reliant mob of enemies. When the game is speaking to you in a language of violence and each enemy is speaking to you at all different cadences, it's hard for me to respond to each without being pummeled by these stacking cadences and rhythms. When Lies of P's DLC opened with a similar cavalcade of violence that Dark Souls 3 had, I had this sinking feeling of dread, because I felt that the developers may have traded their genuine brilliant balance of difficulty and clear design intention in for simply making a game hard for the sake of hard. For the first time in pretty much my entire history with Lies of P, the first few hours left me feeling genuine despair. For the first time, I felt like the challenges being presented to me were not only too difficult, but potentially unfair in their layout of enemy placement and overall brutality of those enemies. Weak enemies bombarded you around tough ones, and singular mini-boss encounters were so relentless in their aggression and attack patterns that it felt like I had been thrown into the late game to a sequel of Lies of P as a beginner. But really, that's kinda what happened. Coming back to Lies of P after so long made me remember how brilliant the game was, but the time away from the game also meant that my return to it was essentially my first time all over again. Relearning the game's pace and structure of violence was like relearning a specific dialect of violence that Lies of P had always been using. If I had any legitimate criticisms of Overture, one of them would be that despite my more or less indifference to ganks in Souls games, even if I put up with them in Dark Souls 2, the entire zoo is not only a brutal introduction due to them being implemented, but the DLC does a poor job of committing to it. And I want to clarify that I'm not saying that I'm annoyed that the expansion didn't commit to overwhelming me with a lot of enemies. What I am saying is that Overture gives you an incorrect expectation to what the DLC will be, with a lot of them right out at the forefront and then slowly dwindling them and becoming sincerely more fair with its enemy placement from around Chapter 2 onward, and in my opinion does leave a bad first impression. As the DLC continued onward after fighting horrific looking baboons and kangaroos, a mutated penis elephant, and a gigantic alligator, Overture begins to finally calm the fuck down a bit and allows not only the player to breathe, but also the narrative. Stumbling upon the genuinely breathtaking sculpture left behind in the past and being found in the past present means that you have stumbled upon the expansion's storyline. As you finally embark on finding the woman in red, suddenly the game finds its footing, and for a long while, it is pure, unadulterated joy. The new weapons are tons of fun. The Lorenzini bolt is pure expansion bait, as it is truly a unique idea that is off-kilter and wacky as hell, leading not to only funny situations and encounters, but can be used as a strategic option when trying to move in or out of combat quicker than a dodge or running normally would allow you. The giant pinwheel weapon is low-key genius, leading to huge swings if allowed to charge up beforehand, creating devastating damage to enemies, and the bow and arrow was more or less the fixed bow and arrow that From Software made in Night Rain, but significantly more focused as it doesn't have to compete with up to 2 other players in the same game at the same time. But going back to the initial area of the game, it's honestly weird how much the expansion pares down the bombardment of this overwhelming you with enemies type of encounter as the DLC progresses. And to be honest, I'm not really sure if that's what was happening or if I was just becoming more accustomed to the rhythm of the game after so much time being away from it. But regardless, once it finally began to slow down, at least for me, I not only remembered that, holy shit, Lies of P is incredible, but on top of that, Overture does nearly everything just right. All of these new areas and enemies are the team firing off on all cylinders with the knowledge that they've gained after making an entire game beforehand. Now, the other thing that I would critique this DLC for is not something only very specific and will require a little bit of preamble, but potentially is something that will get fixed as time goes on with a patch down the line. I said it in my original video, but I will reiterate it here. I do not play the Souls games for the boss fights. It's not like I hate them or anything, but the reason that I play these games and continue to play these games is for the moment-to-moment gameplay and the incredibly strong level design. Yes, even Dark Souls 2. I've played through the Dark Souls games at least twice, but Dark Souls 2 takes the cake for the most completed attempts. I've beaten Dark Souls 2 bare minimum 8 times. And at least 6 of those 8 times have been the same exact build. I love greatswords, and I love greatswords in Dark Souls 2, and I must refuse to do anything other than that because to me, it feels the best, and when I want to replay these games, I simply want to experience the level design, the simple and elegant combat design, and still enjoy the tense but significantly less intense combat that the boss fights provide. Now, both Sekiro and Lies of P are that exception to me, due to the type of feel that parrying provides these kinds of games. The way that my brain works makes my interaction with these bosses so much more analytical, whereas the way I tackle the main Souls games are much more based on feel, which leads me to get hit a lot more often than I do in P or Sekiro. I have gone back to the Reflections of Strength in Sekiro several times just to get that rush of relearning the movesets and conquering the bosses, and I've already gotten plenty of enjoyment out of the new boss selection mode that has been added to Lies of P. The bosses in the PLC are across the board generally very, very good. They tend to lean in one of 2 ways. Dude with a sword, which are my personal favorite, and Big Thing Swing. All of them provide a new sort of challenge, either not fully explored in the base game, or are new ideas entirely. They experiment with bosses that utilize more AoEs, one that dramatically changes midway through with the transformation, and one that utilizes 2 different targets that alternate focus from the player. Each one of these are truly challenging but rewarding boss fights that ratchet up the tension of each fight very well and will require a lot of the player in order to defeat. None of these fights feel unfair, and I do think that is genuinely commendable. The latter category of the 2 previously mentioned boss fight types is the least infrequent, and in my opinion, is the type of fight that, while not impossible for me to nail down and become competent at, they feel the most unreadable in the heat of the moment. These types of bosses need to be clearly telegraphed due to their attacks usually dealing some of the highest damage in the game. Now, the other thing that I have to take time to critique in this DLC is the Anguished Guardian boss fight. It is so rare for me to become angry, let alone irritated, at Lies of P. I think the only time I have ever become distraught fighting a boss fight in the original game was the King of Puppets when the game originally launched, pre-patch. His health pool was enormous. He had 2 phases that took forever, and the second phase would just annihilate me, almost immediately. That is nothing compared to the trauma that the Anguished Guardian gave me. I don't even know where I'm at! Oh my fucking god! This fucking guy is by far my least favorite fight in not only the DLC, but the entire game of Lies of P. It is a monstrous, tedious fight that is filled with attacks that are not necessarily fully telegraphed, huge damage swings, and attacks that require such specific timing or off-kilter timing that requires such precision that the lessons learned towards defeating him are guaranteed to be filled to the brim with deaths that don't feel quite fair. All of this coupled with the fact that this motherfucker's health pool is enormous. Dude, who the fuck gave this piece of shit that health pool? I had to look up a guide to crack the code of dwindling his health down to the point where the first phase took less than 5 minutes. If I hadn't looked up a reliable weapon and Legion arm combination, odds are I would still be fighting this asshole. This fight was so miserable that I can't help but look at the PLC with some skewed, disappointing glare that will potentially forever be a sore spot on something that, in my opinion, is truly wonderful. I was stuck on this boss fight for 3 full fucking sessions, each one lasting bare minimum 2 hours, while some went up to as far as 4. It is so rare for me to be stuck on a fight in a Souls game like this, but this guy had the worst combination of the worst elements of a boss fight imaginable. I can only pray that he gets nerfed to at least some extent. Like, literally, all he needs is like a 10% health reduction rate, and I think I'll be able to move on from this, but I cannot emphasize enough how miserable this fight was and continues to be at the time of making this portion of the video. I can't sum it up better than my emotions were at the end of my fight when I finally beat this motherfucker. 3 days! Now, with all that being said, the point that I'm making is basically entirely forgiven by the final fight of the PLC. I won't go into spoilers in case you still haven't experienced this for yourself, but I think that the last boss fight of the DLC is my favorite boss fight in the entire game. The whiplash that I felt from the absolute despair of the Anguished Guardian going into the over-elated joy that the final boss fight provided me is what comas are induced by. Unlike the Guardian, where every single death felt more and more like the boss being designed in a way that felt unfair, every time that I died to the final boss fight in this PLC, the more hyped I got to encounter it all over again. The music is incredible, utilizing the tick-tocks from the clock that you see in the death animation screen as part of the orchestra. You have the option of fighting this boss fight with a sidekick, and the voice actress for that boss fight is so good, I cannot emphasize that I wanted to cry every time that she got heated in the moment. I felt the pain and torment her character was going through, and I felt it vicariously through her voice acting, and every single time it made that death that I experienced completely okay because I got to relive that moment over and over again. I might straight up cry though when she screams at the end of that first phase. I'm like, it's so intense. All of the boss fights, apart from the Anguished Guardian in the DLC, are very good, but the final fight is the highlight of the entire game. Bar none, not even close. Potentially one of the best fights I've encountered in any Souls-like game, period. So we're talking the highest highs and some of the lowest lows that I've experienced in the entire game, all condensed into a tight, yet still expansive 6 to 8 hour long DLC. For the price of $30, it's honestly hard to not hold much against this, especially because the general quality around the Anguished Guardian fight is so consistently baseline solid, leaning into fantastic. But despite all of that, I couldn't help but shake the feeling that in the end, this is just more Lies of P. Now that sounds like a bad thing, but I promise you that it is not. The more that I played, the more that I found myself realizing that because the developers understood the assignment of what a DLC for Lies of P should be. And that's just more of a good thing. Having come back to the game after nearly 2 years really put a lot of things into perspective for me regarding Lies of P in general. For a DLC about going back in time, the simple act of playing through Lies of P at all again felt like my own sense of time travel. I've since moved apartments ever since that first video came out, and at the point of reading this line, I've just moved again. But playing through some of these bosses after so long put me right back into that old room where I played through Lies of P initially. It brought back feelings of nostalgia and a point of my life where I was floundering with finances, struggling with personal dilemmas, and YouTube in general. And a part of me is sure that underneath all of the wonderful time that I had with Overture, at least some of the joy that I felt was due to that remembrance of a time when Lies of P was brand new, and that feeling realizing that my video on the game did so well. Am I bathing in nostalgia? Yeah, maybe a bit, but I think it's worth mentioning to at least some extent. Lies of P and the video that I made about it sort of changed my outlook on a lot of things in general. It helped me out of a financial hole as well as got me a much wider audience than I ever had before. A part of me worries, though, that my feelings about Lies of P as it connects with me and my life could be getting in the way of my overall feelings with the expansion in the same way that I worried that recency bias would affect my opinion of the main game back when it released. I think, though, that I can safely say that after 2 years, coming back to Lies of P, there were so many points during these 2 run-throughs of the DLC that I did and the parts of the base game that I had to push through to get there. I had that wonderful, gleeful realization that the game is really as good as I remembered it being. Overture, in the end, didn't blow me away or make me say that the base game feels lesser in comparison, but what Overture is, first and foremost, is a general refinement. Some light expansions on the established systems and plenty of new ideas and several new highs that showcase that the game really is as amazing as I remembered it being, nostalgia or personal feelings aside. For the asking price, I can't say that it feels unworthy of its $30 entry fee, but I also can't say that it's the best part of the game entirely. Lies of P really changed my life, and I was kind of hoping that Overture maybe would do the same, but in the end, Lies of P Overture did not ruin Lies of P for me. But it did, in the end, make me realize that, yeah, holy shit, Lies of P is incredible.
Tomato is a fruit, but it's also a vegetable.